Good afternoon and welcome to the Gulf International Forum for a special book talk. My name is Kristian Ulrichsen and I'm a senior non-resident fellow at the Gulf International Forum. I'm also a research fellow at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston. And it's a great pleasure to feature this book talk with Dania Thafer, Dr. Dania Thafer, who is of course the executive director of the Gulf International Forum itself, and is now in the very nice position of doing a book talk at the institute that she has so capably led for the last 5 years. Before I introduce Dr. Thafer and the book, I would just like to say that this really a golden period in publishing about the Gulf states the last few years. We've seen some really excellent books across the 6 GCC states that have really gone deeper and redefined a lot of the scholarship that we have been looking at. They've gone deeper than books about one or two country studies and really looked at the Gulf as a whole, but looking at the Gulf changing, the Gulf shifting politically, economically, in terms of demography. I'm thinking of books by Cinzia Bianco and David Roberts and Jean-Luc Saman. And this is part of Dr. Thafer's book, is part of that historiography that we're now seeing coming through, which is really reshaping the field of Gulf studies in exciting new ways. And so it's a real pleasure for me to moderate this book talk. Dr. Thafer is, as I said, the executive director of GIF, based in Washington, D.C., and also a professorial lecturer at the School of Foreign Service, Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. As many of you know, her expertise is on the Gulf region security, on US Gulf relations, and on the political economy of the Gulf states. Dr. Thafer has widely published, consults regularly on matters concerning the GCC in the Middle East. And her book is entitled Creative Insecurity, Institutional Inertia and Youth Potential in the GCC. And it came out last year by Oxford University Press in North America and by Hurst and Company in the UK. She's also co-authored 2 edited books, The Arms Trade, Military Services, and the Security Market in the Gulf States, Trends and Implications, as well as The Dilemma of Security and Defense in the Gulf region. She's featured in numerous international media outlets, including the New York Times, Financial Times, BBC World, the Washington Post, Forbes, Al Jazeera, and others. So it's a great pleasure to have Dania, Dr. Thafer, with us to talk about her book. It's a really excellent book, and I look forward to discussing it with you. If I could begin, Dr. Thafer, what inspired you to write this book, and why did you focus on the themes of innovation, youth, and state-business relations in the Gulf?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kristian, for having me with you for this book talk, and also the kind introduction. So there were a few key factors that contributed to me pursuing this particular topic for my book. First and foremost, from a global perspective, the pace of innovation has accelerated globally. It has disrupted and is currently transforming industries, economies, and society. And so the capacity to innovate is an essential national security interest. And with innovation comes nearly limitless potential for new products, services, startups, companies, entire industries, which is a vital element for achieving true economic diversification. And for the Arab Gulf states, there are 3 seismic shifts that I believe are poised to reshape their future stability. And they are intricately related to innovation. The youth bulge, of course, is a key issue. A shift in the demographics is extremely important. And this is also related to the energy transition that's going on globally, and the fourth industrial revolution, which is incredibly important. The youth in the Middle East are very important actors and are now recognized as a category to consider in both political and economic calculations of states in the region. Um, the youth, they have galvanized a social change. They've steered their countries to embrace bold policies, and in fact, they made history. And so this is the right time for the governments to put them at the center of their economic reform plans. And as studies have shown, large youth populations can be a boon or a curse. Nurtured and integrated, they can jumpstart stratospheric growth. But if alienated and confined, they can drain a society politically and economically. And the GCC states in the Middle East more broadly have reached this demographic critical juncture, management of which will determine their economic and political stability for decades to come. As I mentioned, they are the largest part of the society, and they are currently entering the workforce rapidly and increasing numbers. And how they are integrated in the economy today is going to be very important for the future. The expanding workforce creates the potential for a unique demographic dividend, a sweet spot, if you will, in the age structure of the workforce that is highly conducive to elevated levels of economic productivity, but only if the right conditions are in place that incentivize innovation and a productive labor force. And so, therefore, it is important during this critical juncture that the most important resource for innovation is harnessed, which is human capital, and the large youth population is very important in that equation. The second that I mentioned was energy transition, and this has become more and more important more recently. Um, Reducing carbon footprints and developing climate resilience requires major social, economic, and technological changes that are intrinsically linked to innovation led development and youth participation in the labor force. So the global energy transition away from fossil fuels has been like a major driving force in economic reform. All the GCC states have made net zero carbon and greenhouse gas emission pledges, and some of them have already begun to embrace a green economy. And the scaling up of new technologies associated with nuclear, renewables, hydrogen, carbon capture, among other areas, are really going to be a focal point for innovation led development in the Gulf states. The third item is the fourth industrial revolution, which I also mentioned. The GCC states have largely missed the economic opportunities of the third industrial revolution, and they should be taking advantage rather quickly of the fourth industrial revolution, which is a fusion of digital, biological, and physical spheres of technological development. And so this is a key turning point because the Gulf states have these large populations that can contribute greatly to their transformation. And as we stand at a brink of technological revolution that will fundamentally alter the way we live, we work, and probably relate to one another. So the scale, scope, and complexity is very important and can be very disruptive. And therefore, it's important that the Gulf states expeditiously pursue innovation through youth-centered economic development. so they can take advantage of this industrial revolution. My opinion, failure to effectively integrate them through the energy transition journey and seize the opportunity of this revolution will greatly jeopardize national security. Um, and many of the Gulf economies is that these strategic objectives are really important for state survival. And the issue is, which I do talk about extensively in my book, is these objectives often conflict with the interests of business elites. And for the GCC, it's a national security imperative to cash in their demographic dividend by averting the deleterious effect of ill-disposed elite politics.
Great, no, thank you. I absolutely agree that this is a time of great change, and the sense that there are so many different wheels in motion. And of course, for the Gulf states, which are major hydrocarbon producers, the very fact that the energy transition is focusing on a transition away from, or at least beyond, fossil fuels is particularly potentially disruptive, as you say. And so one gets a sense that things will change quite dramatically. And as this is why the book is so timely. So, how does your book explore the nexus between national security, innovation, and state business relations?
Well, frankly, my book is on the politics of innovation in the GCC states. Um, Achieving innovation really demands a business culture and incentive structure that fosters a spirit of risk taking and entrepreneurship that turns research into viable commercial products. However, for nations worldwide, aligning innovation requirements with commercial interests really presents a challenge due to the often divergent priorities. And that's why it's crucial to really have an economic and political system that supports a robust innovation environment in the private sector to reduce this risk. And in my book, I explore the nexus between national security, innovation, and state business relations in the GCC. And the governments will need to consider the business elites as their strongest allies in the reform equation. Um, and they are very important players that I think can contribute greatly to Gulf economies, but they also can affect them very negatively. Um, and they can also be the biggest enemy for the state when it comes to the reform equation. The government and the business aids are two key players in boosting economic growth through innovation. And for the GCC, how well they work together and how much autonomy the government has to conduct required economic reforms can determine how successful they are in leveraging their youth populations to achieve the fourth industrial revolution and the transition into the post-fossil fuel era. And in my book, I evaluate how institutional environments affect the state's autonomy to conduct reforms. And I do this by several approaches. I conduct a historical institutional analysis, a longitudinal global study. I've done contemporary case studies across the GCC states and I've conducted 80 interviews with members of parliaments, government officials, the youth, business elite members to kind of get a better understanding of how things are in the Gulf. I will say that my book, most of the research goes from like, let's say 2006 to 2015 is the time span I focus on. I do talk about more current developments as I develop the book further. And so I find it very interesting, some of these points that I talk about in the book and I started to research. When I got the final version of my book, I had to go back and edit because there has been so much movement in the Gulf states in reference to innovation-led development and all of the issues that I talk about in the book.
Indeed, a very fast-paced part of the world. And a key concept in your book is creative insecurity. How do you define and address this concept?
So creative insecurity, which is actually the main title of the book as well, is a new concept I introduce, and it's a condition in which the state's institutional ecosystem suppresses opportunities for innovation to the extent that it causes economic and political vulnerabilities that threaten national security. So, thus, creative insecurity can really serve as a defining line between a state's success and failure, especially when it comes to innovation. Given the current framework of Gulf economies, the standard assumption that young people will maximize their welfare by participating in the private sector isn't plausible in many cases. And the Gulf states have worked to change that. Similarly, the environment created by the economies, the GCC economies, does not really incentivize business elites who are only nominally focused on development pathways to maximize profits to contribute, and they're not really contributing to dynamic private sectors that can sustain and harness the youth talents. And I think this is a major struggle for the economies. Therefore, with this regard, the pursuit of developing innovative economies that can accommodate all of the major objectives that I discussed really creates this kind of peculiar set of challenges for economic diversification. And to understand creative security, I use critical political economy as a theoretical lens that's at the intersection of economic and security studies. I assess both the economic and political spheres with emphasis on security threats caused by unequal division of wealth and power. Um, and critical political economy assesses how the inequality of power and wealth and the role of private sector actors influence these conditions can also serve as a threat to the state. Fundamentally, challenges that are customary of understanding national security threats at the state level are not are important, but I also think identifying private corporations as both potential threats and also potential providers of national security is really important. Um, uh, and this theoretical lens recognizes that authority can be exercised by private non-state actors that influence market forces. Um, and they can obscure the state's autonomy to manage security dynamics of the economy. So basically, anything that threatens state autonomy, the state's autonomy to have a narrow range of policy choices available to the government. So anything that narrows the range of policy choices available to the government and degrades the quality of the life of the inhabitants of the state could be really categorized as a national security threat.
Indeed. And why have you chosen then to also focus on the business elite to address innovation-driven development? What was the rationale there?
Well, I think that they are very they are important actors, and the literature has talked about the business elites from many different perspectives. But I think in the current era, I think there's still a very understudied private sector actor. And we've been in so many talks about diversification, and they're usually about, diversifying away from hydrocarbons, but don't really talk about the important role that the business elites pose for the success of these Gulf states achieving their national goals. And a major challenge for innovation in the Gulf is could be the political or economic dominance of the business elite families, and I will tell you why. They are extremely important because they exert control over a significant portion of the private sector, with projections showing their wealth. And I will say this is a few years ago. Maybe it might have changed a little bit, but their wealth amounting to a staggering $3 trillion. Business elite families, they control 3/4 of the private sectors, and they employ 70% of the labor force. Um, and most importantly, I think, is due to the lack of institutional incentives by the state. The majority of these family-owned businesses very seldomly invest in research and development. And now that raising productivity through innovation is exceedingly important for the main points that I introduced with, the dominance of the business elite can really constrict those economic objectives. Um, and so the incentive structure of the economies, which has evolved over the course of the years, still does divide like the interests of the business elite and labor. And it undermines this mutual incentive to invest in innovation. Um, so the book does explore how business elites can manipulate and impair political and economic institutions, limiting the state's autonomy for reform. But it also talks about how working with the business elites also can be very beneficial for the economy. So if the case is the Gulf states are not able to reform, this really can have a disruptive effect on the stability of the Gulf states.
Well, yes, and as you were saying, you were doing the research between 2006 and 15, and in that period alone, we had an oil price boom followed by a deep oil price collapse, then another period of high oil prices after 2010, another collapse in 2014, 15, and even since the end of the time when you were doing your research, we've had a further collapse with COVID in 2020, but then another oil boom after 2021. So this kind of wild swing in revenue and kind of public sector kind of revenue generation is clearly something that it's in everybody's interest to try and move beyond, because otherwise you see these kind of swings that don't necessarily provide kind of good long-term economic policy forecasting. So how is state autonomy another key concept in your book? How do you define state autonomy? And do GCC states have full autonomy to achieve their national visions?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's something that I try to address in this book. Um, so to take a step back, I want to talk about some of the developmental goals in the GCC countries' national visions. And part of their national vision is also to stoke innovation and economic reform and realize a demographic dividend. Though sometimes it's not explicitly said, it's very obvious. Um, and so the GCC states have each attempted to closely link their visions to youth focused development and innovation led development strategies. They have established economic institutions geared towards harnessing youth talent. Um, and they have really been trying to engage young people in the private sector. And obviously, all the Gulf states are not the same. I mean, different ones have different strategies. More have been much more progressive and forward thinking about how they've approached this. Um, So they have attempted to foster ecosystems of collaboration to increase entrepreneurism and the growth of SMEs, small and medium sized enterprises. They have launched an array of initiatives to establish ecosystems. This includes business accelerators, co-working space, firm incubators, and seed investment funds. And these were all accomplished through state institutions. For example, in Bahrain, you have Temkeen. In Kuwait, you have the Kuwait National Fund for Small and Medium Enterprises Development. The Qatari Development Bank is huge. In Saudi Arabia, there's the MISC Foundation. In UAE, there has been a proliferation of these sort of institutions. The Dubai Future Accelerator, the Sharjah Entrepreneurship Center, Ras Al Khaimah Chamber of Commerce and Industry's Youth Enterprise Development Initiative, which I find very interesting. Still, the level of clout held by private sector the business leaders in the private sector really forces the question, to what extent do these states have the autonomy to achieve their developmental goals? It's important to understand, even within the GCC, state autonomy varies dramatically. And different state structures have different capacities for reform. And so autonomy is crucial for the obvious reasons. It's incredibly crucial for states to pursue their desired policies. And as such, it's fundamentally connected to the fate of creative insecurity. And variance in state autonomy within the GCC could be a defining factor when it comes to attaining the demographic dividend, and could address the problem of creative insecurity. However, there is a lack of research on how GCC economies fare with regards to the nexus of states' economic performance and their autonomy to conduct these reforms. And as we know, the prevailing scholarship on political economy of the GCC states, often rooted in the rentier literature, dubiously inflates the role of the state, and it really assumes that the state has near complete autonomy. And so this book challenges this narrative and seeks to understand the concept of state autonomy and how it may affect it by looking at various state structures, societal forces, and institutions. So by utilizing different frameworks, the book really emphasizes on the importance of a coherent and cohesive state apparatus that is closely tied to the economic elite. So the state must share a common interest with the business elite in order to conduct reform. Therefore, an effective institutional environment is necessary for the state to have the autonomy to achieve its reform. And I define state autonomy for the purpose of this research. I think there could be also much broader definitions. But for the purpose of this research, I define it as the degree of independence that the state has to implement economic reforms in spite of pressure from the business elites.
I mean, one of the things I like about your book so much is that you do exactly challenge rentier state literature and some of the assumptions in rentier state theory, which have had such a grip on the political economy literature for so long. And yours is just one of numerous books recently that have tried to go beyond rentier state literature. And of course, look at the Gulf in the 2020s, not the Gulf in 1980s or the 1970s. And so encourage everyone to follow that literature, the way it's developing. How does your book explore the ways in which business elites exert leverage to advance their own economic interests through both informal and formal institutional channels?
Well, a lot of this, the points that you address in your question, are focused on in chapters 6 and 7. In those chapters, I examine how business elites leverage to leverage their power to advance economic interests through both formal and informal institutional channels, and sometimes it's at the expense of state-led economic reform. And I argue that the more bargaining power the business elites possess within these institutions, the less autonomy the state has. Second, I consider the variation of state-led capitalism across the GCC private sectors, and this is in chapter 6. And this variation really holds consequence for many aspects of the GCC states' economic development trajectories, including the distribution of power in the private sector between the state and the business elites. And in general, the higher the degree of state-led capitalism in these private sector, the greater the state's autonomy to conduct reforms. And the lower the degree of state autonomy that the states have to conduct these necessary reforms for its survival, the more vulnerable the state is to creative insecurity. And so evaluating how elites exert leverage to advance their economic interests through informal and formal institutional channels, I look at Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain, and I evaluate the level of business elite influence over institutions and their ability to influence the economic reform process as a determinant of the level of business elite dominance. So higher degree of business elite dominance, more obstacles for innovation-led development. Now, I look into 2 or 3 cases. So I look at Kuwait, Kuwait's National Assembly, which was just suspended for up to 4 years. Well, in the National Assembly, generally speaking, the business elite, they do hold significant influence, with many key positions occupied from members of the merchant families, and namely the speakership is one of them, that has mostly throughout history been held by a business elite member. And the business elites have been able to reverse economic reforms that was against their interest by aligning with the government, particularly during periods of intense conflict with oppositional parliaments. So oppositional leaning parliaments attempted to challenge the dominance of both the government and the business elite by passing regulations to increase transparency in the private sector, but were often undermined by the alignment between the business elite and the government. And we saw an example of this with the Build, Operate, and Transfer law enacted in 2008. And so in Kuwait, you have 2 divergent forces, the opposition versus the business elite, and they're often pitted against each other in many situations. But they do share a commonality, and I think this probably relates to what happened with the parliament more recently in reference to its suspension. So the jolting against and for elite dominance really undermines reforms beneficial to economic prosperity of Kuwait, and really the youth entering the private sector. And what happens is when the parliament is very oppositional, the business elite try to align with the state to extract more concessions for themselves. Now, it'll be very interesting what will happen now that there is no parliament, and see how the reform process goes, and how the business elite will try to negotiate, and how this will affect their political power in Kuwait. Now, in Bahrain, business elites have negotiated and for their own interests, what they put forward and up for negotiation, I've have examples of how it was significantly diluted in the negotiation process, meaning that the government was able to push, um, for the most part, what the government wanted to achieve. And in Bahrain, business influence is really tempered by the dominance of the ruling family and members of government institutions. And so, although there's an elected parliament, part of the parliament is elected, usually business elite interests are served through informal connections. And they really tend to push their and lobby their interests at the appointed part of the parliament, more than the elected part of the parliament. Now, in Qatar, the push and pull and reform was very minimal compared to the other two states, namely Kuwait and Bahrain. The Qatari government manages to pass reforms rather swiftly. And the lines between the state and business are kind of blurred, and it's much more informal. And so in Qatar, they have the Qatari Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and also the newly elected parliament, um, and which is actually right now, as since Kuwait is parliament is disbanded for the near future, makes Qatar, interestingly enough, one of the more powerful parliaments. But it is, I think, has elected many bureaucrats to be in the position of those members of parliament. So I don't see so many challenges in that regard. But through state-led capitalism, the Qatari government really plays a direct role in the economy. Um, through state-owned enterprises. So a distinguishable characteristic of the Qatari system versus the other ones that I spoke about is that the state really gives appointments in large SOEs as a transfer of wealth and influence, to different groups, and especially the business elite. Um, and so as you look at important critical junctures for Qatar for reform, if you go back to even 1982, the stock market crash, the 2008 financial crisis, um, the more recent negotiations with labor and exit visa requirements in 2017, and more recently, you will find that for the most part, the Qatari government was able to swiftly push forward its reforms. So the push and pull in Qatar was very limited. Now, Chapter 6, I'll try to talk about it very quickly. Chapter 6 draws on a comparison between the Gulf states with high degrees of business elite influence over the economy and ones with more centralized state-led capitalism, to illuminate how these dynamics affect the viability of achieving economic reforms. And highlighting the difference between the private sectors dominated by the state, like in Qatar, and ones dominated by business elite, like in Kuwait, it does help to shed light on the obstacles to economic reform. Um, and with the narrow choices available to Gulf economies, state-led capitalism really provides the best chance for economic reforms needed to successfully achieve the demographic dividend. Now, I know I've gotten some pushback about my views on state-led capitalism being very important, but I think in this current era, where fundamentally all of the economic power is through the state's role is extremely important. Of course, the organic role of SMEs and entrepreneurs are extremely important. But I think in this era, in this context, in this point of history in Gulf states, that state capitalism is the most opportune way to go about it. So the capacity to implement reform is measured through state capitalism, as I mentioned, and a degree of business elite influence. Um, And what is state-led capitalism? Because that is a key concept in the book. And it differs from the free market in two ways. First, state adopted as a long-term policy and view markets primarily as serving national interests. And you can see this very clearly in the Gulf states. Key institutions that are important to state-led capitalism are sovereign wealth funds and state-owned enterprises. Although these being present do not necessarily mean that there is state-led capitalism, they are definitely strong indicators of it. And so the high level of state-led capitalism allows the state to execute more versatile and expedient responses to economic reform measures. And this is a huge assumption that I make. I'm assuming that the state is a rational actor, meaning that the state will act in its survival and its economic well-being for the future to come. And for the private sector, I look at the degree of state-led capitalism in three ways. The distribution of state ownership in top companies. And so that's very high in Qatar, much lower in Kuwait. The distribution of board seats across major companies. In Qatar, you see state actors really occupying all of the board seats and ruling family members. Whereas in Kuwait, you see merchant families retain the largest portion of the seats. In Bahrain, interestingly, you'll see like the ruling family and chairman seats, followed by top three business elite families in other seats. And I look at the number of oligarchic players, the amount of wealth concentrated in the hands of a few elite families. This is very high in Kuwait, much lower in Qatar. So you can kind of see this trend play out when I look at the different cases. I think this is also the 3 points I talked to. I think the question about Kuwait being able to herald the economic reform with the disbandment of the parliament really comes to questioning all of these factors and how much influence the business elites have across private sector institutions. So it'll be very interesting to watch in Kuwait this next couple of years.
Great, thank you. And the final question, because we're running low on time, but I see that you conducted a global quantitative analysis of 129 countries, evaluating business elite dominance, institutions, and innovations, which are variables crucial to creative insecurity. Could you share some of your findings?
Yes. Well, this quantitative study was done for the years between 2007 and 2016. I looked at 129 countries, looking at how the degree of business elite market dominance affects innovation, how's institutional performance affects innovation, and also I looked at resource wealth to see how all of those work together in confluence. Of course, if you do just a regular analysis, you'll say, okay, yes, wealthy countries tend to have less innovation. This is something that you'll see across when you study cross-nationally across the globe. However, rather than totally condemning rentier economies, one can say that institutional quality is a driver of innovation. So when I interact institutional quality into the variables of innovation and rentier states, I find that really it's institutional quality that's the main driver of innovation. And so, yes, rentier economies with low institutional performance really compounds the negative effects on innovation. And maybe that's a question that, we can look at for Kuwait. But however, rentier states with high level of institutional qualities do have a positive relationship globally when you look at innovation. And other things that I found is that working age population growth has a positive relationship with innovation. Um, and so it's very important, and that's why I talk about the demographic dividend and market dominance across the board. The higher degree you have of market dominance, the lower level of innovation. And so that's why it's important um, to strike that balance. I also looked at the Asian miracle economies during the period they were trying to achieve the demographic dividend. And I found during that period of trying to develop innovation and achieve the demographic dividend, a coherent and cohesive state apparatus that has the autonomy to influence the economic elite was very critical to the success of the Asian miracles. Of course, they're very different economic and political contexts, but I think they are good studies to look at for successfully achieving um, the demographic dividend. I want to go back to a point um, about the asymmetry of interests of reform in institutional environments for the business elite. I think by virtue of the incentive structure, the challenges for innovation led development is instead of investing in research and development to create new products and develop nascent industries, I think the business elite families have been really incentivized to be agents of big contracts and turnkey projects. And so this inherent political and economic logic and incentive structure is really challenging. Um, Moving forward with just overbuilt real estate market, all these commissioned white elephant mega projects, they can be very useful in how they're approached, but can be a opportunity cost for youth employment. So the problem with this dynamic is local production would run counter to the interests of business elite families, and so the exclusive nature of all of these like contracts and agreement really erects barriers for newcomers. So it's something that should be considered when the Gulf states um, approach the reform. Now, going back to the institutions, I know I'm jumping around, but I'm remembering some things that I haven't said. Low quality institution, a question that's always asked about rentier states: are they endogenous or exogenous to the rentier state? And I think there are many factors to consider of the quality of institutions. And with my historical analysis, I looked at the several variables: oil's discovery, the timing of state formation, the institutional development, um, and how institutions develop, and the strength of the business elites. All of these in confluence really affect the quality of institutions. So it's not true that just oil wealth itself causes low institutional quality, low institutional quality. Um, Kristian, do you have another question for me, or should I close? Or
I think we've reached the end of the questions. I think the scale of your responses illustrates very nicely just how much detail the book goes into. And for me, it was particularly useful to see your comparative studies. You focused on Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar, but also on the Gulf more generally. But to show how there is no one size fits all approach. The Gulf is not simply one block of oil or gas rich countries. There are significant variations among the six GCC states. And so, in my view, that's one of the real takeaways is that although they do share to some extent common challenges and opportunities, there are differences also in the ways in which these dynamics play out across different or individual country specific contexts. And so I thought that was extremely useful. I think the creative insecurity is going to be with us for quite some time. And of course, as you mentioned, the global kind of trends that we're seeing with the energy transition and the fourth industrial revolution, we often hear about this being a time of disruption. And I think we're going to see a lot of disruption in the years ahead. And so, again, the book is a very good snapshot of where we are in the early 2020s at this moment in time when we are about to see a moment of great change. And so I'd like to maybe close this by thanking you very much for speaking about your book. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk about it with you. And to everyone on this webinar, I would urge you to read Dania's book because it's really excellent and it's a very solid and very timely piece of writing. So thanks again, Dania.
Thank you, Kristian, for having the discussion with me, and I look forward to see the Gulf governments continue to develop centralized institutional frameworks dedicated to research and development, embark on labor reforms, and harness their human capital and fortify transparency in corporate governances. Those are some key points. I'm not going to go on anymore because I'm excited about my own book. But thank you all for listening, and thank you, Kristian, for having this book talk with me.
Thank you.